All right. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Asian Pragmatism Network webinar series for 2025. Glad to have you with us. Our guest today is Dr. Juho Lindholm, PhD from the University of Tartu in Estonia, resident in Finland. A little bit about our webinar series, an Asian Pragmatism Network. Asian Pragmatism Network, or APN, we are a sort of startup learned association. We've just started our activities this year. We have a strong board behind us. Our mission is to promote the development of pragmatist philosophy in Asian contexts. So we have two different types of scholars we work with. We have scholars who are pragmatism scholars and resident in Asia, using Asia in a very broad sense there, or we have pragmatism scholars who are located anywhere in the world, but connect pragmatism with Asian studies in some way. And that second mode is what we have today. So having a dialogue between Buddhist and pragmatist philosophies is exactly the kind of thing that we're interested in. Taka?
Okay, thank you. Let me introduce Dr. Juho Lindholm. He holds a Master of Science degree in Control Engineering and a PhD degree in Philosophy. He has recently defended his PhD thesis, according to which knowledge is practice. He studies rational worldview from the standpoint of fallibilism, pragmatism, naturalism, the philosophy of techniques, and the philosophy of economics. His ideas include cybernetic epistemology, techniques as hermeneutics, and the potential practice-relatedness of all experience. His publications include Science as Art, a Deweyan Perspective, The Pragmatist Basis of Material Hermeneutics, Cybernetic Epistemology, Scientific Practices as a Social Knowledge, Techniques as Hermeneutics, Human Techniques, Interaction, John Dewey as a precursor of Rein Biharem, and The Problem of Realism in Rein Biharem. He also has a forthcoming article titled Cybernetic Epistemology and Skepticism. His PhD thesis, which he successfully defended last year, is Knowledge and Practice, a Criticism of Epistemology. The floor is yours, Juho.
Thank you. Welcome to my presentation. I will discuss Buddhist and Pragmatist philosophies, and I am relatively new to the Buddhist philosophy, so please consider what I say with a grain of salt. So, to begin, there is some literature on the relation between Buddhism and pragmatism, but not very much. I am aware of something like 20 articles. And in the literature, there are usually two things that scholars have recognized to be in common between Buddhism and pragmatism. The first is, of course, anti-dualism. Both Buddhists and pragmatists believe that the mind is embodied, and therefore there is no room for the dualism of Descartes. The second point in common is fallibilism. Peirce defended fallibilism already when he was something like 29 years old in his epistemological series that was published in several journals. And of course, Siddhartha Gautama was also a fallibilist if you read Kalama Sutta, where he defends the position that you shouldn't accept any doctrine that you have not critically considered yourself, including his own. And therefore, we have good reasons to believe that Siddhartha Gautama himself was a fallibilist. But what is missing in literature is what I am going to present today, because I have found at least three more notions in Buddhist philosophy that are strikingly similar to certain notions in pragmatism. For example, emptiness. It corresponds to the pragmatist notion of anti-essentialism. Then, in Buddhism, we have conditionality, and in pragmatism, its counterpart is process ontology. And last but not least, the Buddhists have this notion of not self. And in pragmatism, we have synechism, which emphasizes the continuity of the person with their environment, which leads to the notion that there is no substantial essence to a human personality. So, most of my talk will consist in my explaining of how I understand pragmatism. I have relatively little to say about Buddhism because I'm relatively new to Buddhist philosophy. I have only studied it for something like 3 years, and I will be the first to acknowledge my ignorance about this great tradition. So if I am wrong, please correct me. Second, I will explain the Buddhist notions of emptiness, conditionality, and not self, and I will show how they correspond to their pragmatist counterparts, which are, as I said, anti-essentialism, process ontology, and synechism. I will briefly point out some differences between Buddhism and pragmatism, and then I will make some conclusions. I will begin with Peirce's phenomenology. Peirce, who founded pragmatism, created an original phenomenology which differs somewhat from the phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. Peirce based his phenomenology on the discovery of 3 real and mutually independent categories, which he calls prosaically firstness, secondness, and thirdness. This follows from the application of Augustus de Morgan's logic of relations to the contents of experience. These titles of the categories refer to arity, so whatever falls under monadic predicates manifests firstness. What falls under dyadic predicates falls under secondness, and what falls under triadic predicates falls under thirdness. And Peirce also suggested a proof that higher categories can be reduced to complexes of thirdnesses, so that there are fourthnesses and fifthnesses, but these categories are not independent, because Peirce's reduction thesis holds, so that we can construct all the higher categories by combining thirdnesses or triadic relations. So we only have 3 independent categories. Firstness is manifest in qualities of feeling. Secondness is manifest in effort and resistance. And thirdness is manifest in the establishment of habit. And Peirce didn't say this himself, but we can find this position in Dewey, so that there is no split between experience and nature. And if this holds, then Peirce's categories can be generalized from all experience to all being, so that we also have metaphysical interpretation of these categories. So, for example, chance manifests firstness, efficient causation manifests secondness, and natural laws and evolution manifest thirdness. Now, to apply the third category, we enter synechism, which is one of Peirce's metaphysical theses. It posits a continuum between many, if not all, polar opposites, including mind and matter, or the individual and society, or nature and culture, and so on. These polar opposites have been traditional in Western philosophy, but I suppose that in much of Asian philosophy, including Buddhist philosophy, these opposites don't exist. Correct me if I am wrong, but this is the impression I have acquired. So, continua are an affair of thirdness, because if there is a continuum between polar opposites, a medium is required, and therefore there has to be an infinity of possible values between the extremes. And that is precisely what thirdness does. And like I said, the establishment of habit falls under thirdness. This is because habits are universals. They determine particular actions without reducing to them, so that we can have a finite collection of particular actions, but they don't have the power to determine the next action. Therefore, we need habit. We establish a habit by acting according to a rule, but the rule evolves. When we add a new instance of action, we are establishing a habit, so that the habit acquires the power to determine not only all the actions that we have performed, but also which we can perform. And therefore, we include potential actions, not only actual, but also potential actions, to the domain of what the habit will determine. And this implies that habit is the medium between experience and nature, because a habit cannot form in a vacuum. In order for us to establish a habit, we need a stable environment. And therefore, the habit is not something that reduces to ourselves. It cannot reduce to us, because in order for us to have the habit, the environment must be relatively constant. Because if the environment changes, then our habits will have to adapt again. For example, we may have the habit of drinking water, but if we are located in outer space, then we have to invent a new way to drink water, because there is no gravitation. Okay, from Peirce's phenomenology, we come to Dewey's phenomenology. Dewey was actually doing phenomenology, although he doesn't use the term himself. But if you read his explanations of how experience acquires content from the first person point of view, then you will immediately recognize that it falls under a broad sense of phenomenology. Dewey argues that experience is organism-environment interaction, but if we apply the notion of Karen Barrett, which she introduced in 1996, the definition becomes organism-environment interaction. The point in this neologism is that in some cases, if not all, relations between entities are more basic than the entities themselves. And so we have entities that are mutually responsible for the numerical identity and the determinacy of each other. And actually, we find something similar in Dewey's own words. He has this notion implicitly when he says that if objects were independently determinate and numerically identical, then there would be no such a thing as a problematic situation. And therefore, Dewey is saying that in order to resolve a problematic situation, this numerical identity and determinacy of objects has to be affected by us. So it's a result of our actions, not something that we can presuppose. And therefore, we have a cybernetic or ecological epistemology, where experience is not something we undergo, but it's also what we do. So we have a feedback, so that we have organism and we have environment, and they interact so that they are mutually responsible for what they are. And this is cybernetic because of the feedback, so that the organism affects the environment and the environment affects the organism in a cyclical loop. And therefore, the environment is a necessary part of experience, which makes this notion ecological, like Alhanen says. Dewey argues that all experience takes place in a situation. This is a holistic notion. It involves both a number of organisms and their environment. And our habits maintain the coherence of the situation. So, the correct unit of analysis of epistemology has to be sensory-motor circuit. We are not disengaged observers outside nature. On the contrary, we are located in nature and we have bodies. And even if we are not doing anything, our bodies have some effect on the environment. And in order to let nature appear as it is, we have somehow to compensate for our input to this system. And moreover, the pattern of experience is not a reflex arc, so that the reflex arc notion maintains that we are idling by default, and then we acquire stimuli. Then we neurally process these stimuli, which results in overt action. But this is not the case, because usually we are already acting. We are active creatures by nature, and we process and we observe simultaneously when we act, so that we have a loop, so that there is no telling between cause and effect. And therefore, we have to consider the whole sensory-motor circuit. Dewey also emphasizes that epistemic activity is highly specialized. It only makes sense if we presuppose a background of non-epistemic practices, including routine work, the enjoyment of certain goods, or conversation, or games. And therefore, in Dewey's phenomenology, we could say that we don't conceptualize all experience in the terms of epistemology. On the contrary, we first consider a number of background practices and then consider epistemic activity, the express purpose of which is the acquisition of knowledge, as a special case. Now we enter the concept of habit, which is pivotal in classical pragmatism. In my published works, I have defined habit as approximately and relatively invariant pattern of potential organism-environment interaction. This is intended to emphasize the bidirectional way how our experience has been structured, so that the organism and the environment exchange causal signals, including observations and actions, and if there occur somewhat invariant patterns in this exchange, then these patterns are habits. This notion appears first in my cybernetic epistemology, which I published 2 years ago. One of its consequences is that all experience is at least potentially practice-laden. This is a generalization of the thesis that observation is theory-laden. I consider theorizing as one of scientific practices, and therefore the thesis of the theory-ladenness follows as a possible special case of the potential practice-ladenness of experience. This is the case because, as I said, the usual case is that we are already acting, and most of our actions are habitual, and the habit conditions what we observe, because habit has a purpose. It's intended to produce a specific effect, and therefore this purpose acts as a filter, so that we pay attention to the observations that have practical bearings upon what we are doing, and we ignore the rest. Therefore, observations have this order of priority, and our attention is divided according to this priority. And when we engage different practices, the same object can appear differently because it can figure differently in these practices. For example, when we are brushing our teeth, we are attending to the toothbrush. But when we are, for example, cleaning the bathroom, then the toothbrush appears differently because we are not using it. It's just an object we have to put in a specific location. And now my recent publication considers human technology interaction or human techniques interaction. And its basic idea is that because habit involves both an organism and environment, and because instruments are a potential part of our environment, therefore they possibly enter the constitution of our habits. And because human personality is habit, therefore instruments at least potentially enter human personality. Like I said, habit sustains the coherence of a situation, and when habitual action fails, the situation becomes problematic, so that in normal situations we encounter familiar objects, we know what their potential practical effects are. But when we encounter a situation where we are unsure of the potential practical effects of things, or when two objects have contradictory potential practical effects, or when we encounter a new object whose meaning we don't know, then we have a problematic situation. And to resolve a problematic situation, we can use Peirce's belief-doubt model of inquiry. So, the belief-doubt model of inquiry is iterative, so that it consists of cycles which have a schematic structure. So the usual case is we act habitually. Then habitual action fails because of something unexpected. It may be because the situation is new, or some object in the situation is new, or because there are many things of which some may be contradictory. In any case, we sometimes fail. And then the situation becomes problematic. And when we have a problematic situation, we must engage in an inquiry to resolve it in order to resume our habitual action. Then the inquiry has internal structure. According to Peirce, we have a cycle of abduction, deduction, and induction. Abduction consists in the introduction of a new hypothesis that explains our previous failure. Then deduction consists in the application of the so-called pragmatic maxim, which I will shortly introduce, so that we derive certain foreseeable consequences of the hypothesis which we have introduced. Then induction consists in experimentation whether these consequences of our hypothesis are obtained or not. If the induction fails, we have to revert to the abduction. But if the induction succeeds, we establish a new habit that takes the previous failure into account, and then we can resume the first step, or we can continue acting habitually. So, Peirce put very much emphasis on the notion of abduction. So, like I said, it's the process of forming a novel hypothesis. And of the three kinds of inference, it is the only kind that introduces new ideas. Therefore, all our knowledge is, in the final analysis, abductive. And therefore, inquiry involves a creative element. And because of this creative input we put into our epistemic practices, it makes inquiry radically unpredictable. Because if we already knew the results of inquiry, it would have no point. There would be no inquiry. There already would be a habit of action that wouldn't fail. And in his Harvard lectures on pragmatism, Peirce argued that pragmatism itself is the logic of abduction. But the logic of abduction only makes sense if the three categories which I have explained are real, that is, mind independent. There is a lot more to Peirce's semiotics than I can explain in this presentation, but we need to understand the fundamentals. We have to begin with the notion of sign relation. It falls under thirdness because it is a triadic relation that obtains between an object, a sign vehicle, and potential interpretant. So therefore, in order for one thing to stand for another, we need three things. So therefore, meaning or significance is irreducibly triadic. It's necessarily a manifestation of thirdness. Peirce also made a distinction between the dynamical object and the immediate object. We don't need to enter that. The sign vehicle is what we usually consider as what a sign means. So because an object determines a sign vehicle, therefore we acquire the capacity of interpreting the sign vehicle as referring to that object if the sign vehicle and the object are already familiar to us, so that we have already formed a habit that associates them together. But in order to function as a sign relation, we also need this interpretant. So this interpretant is what connects the sign vehicle to the object. And it can be considered as the process of making sense of the sign vehicle, so that we acquire a percept which indicates something that is not present directly, but it can be made present by inquiry. And it only needs to be potential in order for the sign relation to function as a sign relation. So we can appeal to two definitions of interpretant, both by Peirce. So the interpretant can be understood as what the sign vehicle in its significant function essentially determines in its interpreter, or the total proper effect of the sign vehicle taken by itself. So that we have to make a distinction between the interpretant and the interpreter, so that the interpretant is the effect of the sign vehicle upon the interpreter. And the interpreter can be collective, so that we may have a group of scientists who are involved in the same semiotic process. So this all leads to fallibilism, which is one possible point of contact between Buddhism and pragmatism. So we acquire a percept, but because we don't know a priori what this percept is referring to, it kicks off semiosis, or the process of interpretation. Now, because we already have some habits, these habits supply an interpretive perceptual judgment that states that something is like this. I mean, something is like the percept we have apprehended. And this perceptual judgment has truth value. But there is a catch. We are unable to criticize the percept and the perceptual judgments because they are something that the world imposes upon us. And therefore, even if we are unable to criticize them, yet they are fallible. Their epistemic status is problematic. And therefore, everything must be studied as sign vehicles that may or may not represent something not directly present. And that makes all our knowledge, including mathematics and logic, fallible. So here we have the pragmatic maxim. In effect, Peirce argues that the meaning of a thing, which is possibly a speech act, but need not be, consists in its potential practical causes and effects. Peirce himself only speaks about effects, but if we critically consider what he is saying, we also have to include potential practical causes. And these causes and effects may also be speech acts, but they need not be. And because meaning is something that is related to efficient causation, and we are able to understand meanings on the basis of our habits, because our habits are means to ends, and therefore they involve causality by definition. Dewey has explained how experiment gives rise to meaning. So we make an experiment, we do something, then something else will change. Then we undergo the change, we determine its numerical value, then we correlate what we did to what we affected in our environments. And if this correlation persists, we are establishing a habit, so that the habit associates what we do to what we get. And therefore, the cause, or what we do, is related to the effect, or what the results are. And therefore, these two become fallible signs of each other. so that causes and the effects mean the presence of each other. And this holds for both linguistic and non-linguistic meanings. Like, for example, Dewey says that the meaning of a hat is that we wear it on our heads, and this has nothing to do with language. Peirce tried to prove the pragmatic maxim by semiotics, but in a forthcoming paper I argue that his proof is inconclusive. I have devised an alternative proof on what Peirce says elsewhere, but we don't need to go into that. So now we enter the domain of Buddhism. So Buddhist philosophy involves the notion of emptiness or void. The Sanskrit term is sunyata, and the Pali term is sunyata. It's not ontological nihilism. It only means that phenomena do not have permanent essences. They simply transform into each other. This is an important doctrine of Buddhist metaphysics and epistemology. So it's also a middle path between ontological nihilism and essentialism, so that it doesn't mean that nothing exists, and it also doesn't mean that essences exist. It only means that we have phenomena and they transform into each other. So we have a counterpart for this in pragmatism. So if we consider the pragmatic maxim, we have no need to refer to trans-empirical essences. Therefore, we can eliminate them from discourse. Dewey even goes so far as to consider the anti-essentialism that follows a criterion of science, because he argues that when scientists in the 17th century jettisoned Aristotelian mechanics and acquired Galilean mechanics and Newtonian mechanics, this process involved the rejection of the notion that bodies have essences that have their natural purposes. For example, Aristotle had argued that the natural place of all bodies is in the center of the earth, so that they naturally tend towards this telos, or end. But the early modern scientists rejected this notion. There are no purposes in nature, there is only mechanical or efficient causation. And that enabled science to become science. So Dewey continues that therefore science is not concerned with essences at all, because we have no means to determine what an essence of a thing is. All we can say concerns the conditions and consequences of phenomena. Therefore, knowledge itself is about the initiation, sustainment, and termination of phenomena. And this makes knowledge a control engineering problem. In order to understand a thing, we need to be able to control its appearance. And this is the point of contact between Buddhist, pragmatist, and cybernetic epistemologies. Then another important Buddhist doctrine is conditionality. So Buddhists emphasize that all phenomena arise from conditions, and then these conditions arise from their conditions, and so on. And this can be, in principle, continued ad infinitum. Siddhartha Gautama himself didn't have a position about whether the world is created or whether it has been in existence infinitely. But this notion seems to suggest that the world has no beginning. But I am not sure about this, so if I am mistaken, please correct me. Anyway, this notion is called conditionality. The Sanskrit term is idam pratyayata, and the Pali expression is idapatsayata. So then the pragmatist counterpart is evolutionary cosmology, which is a version of process ontology. It seems to follow from the application of Peirce's three categories, firstness, secondness, and thirdness, to metaphysics. Peirce himself said that evolutionary cosmology is simply Darwinism applied to the domain of ontology. So that when we mathematically apply the logic of relations to what exists and what can exist, then we get evolutionary cosmology. And like I said, it involves three doctrines. There is chance, which is firstness, then there is efficient causation, which is secondness, and then there is natural laws and evolution, which are thirdness. And so Peirce argued that everything has emerged from primordial randomness by habit taking, so that he posits a beginning of the world, so that there are many random phenomena, and when relations emerge between these random phenomena, then there emerge secondness and thirdness, and natural laws have emerged as habit-taking processes between random phenomena. And therefore, this notion acquires its name, evolutionary cosmology. In process ontology in general, there are no objects. We only have processes, and what we usually call objects are actually processes in a stationary state in which opposing forces cancel out. And therefore, object ontology describes what is, but process ontology describes what happens. And because of this dynamic nature of the world, we even have to consider the possibility that even laws of nature evolve. And this is not perfectly similar to conditionality in Buddhism, but these notions have some points of contact so that we can compare them. Then probably the most important doctrine of Buddhism is not self. So if phenomena have no permanent essence, then a fortiori, a human being has no permanent essence either. And Siddhartha Gautama argued that there is nothing to the self that does not reduce to the five senses, so that we only have phenomena. And David Hume actually made a similar argument 2,200 years after Siddhartha Gautama. And this notion is called not self, in Sanskrit anatman, and in Pali anatta. Pragmatism has a somewhat similar idea, but Peirce and Dewey don't speak about the five senses. They speak about habits, so that they both believed that the human personality consists in their habits. And because of the practice-ladenness of observation, habits condition observation and action, so that individual observations and actions are meaningless as such. In order to understand them, they have to be incorporated in habitual action, so that we have to understand their potential practical causes and effects. And therefore, in order to understand anything, we need habits, we need thirdness. And now we appeal to synechism. So, because mind and nature, or experience and nature, are continuous via habits, then we are also continuous with each other. And therefore, our personality also involves something that is related to other personalities. And habits change, and therefore so does our personality. And because we are our habits, we don't have a permanent essence. We only have modes of behavior. This is somewhat similar to the Buddhist doctrine of Anatman, because there is nothing inherent to a human being, because their habits could be something else. They are contingent. And this also relates to what I have called human techniques interaction, because techniques are at least potentially a part of our environment, then they also enter the constitution of a human personality, at least potentially. So, we seem to have at least 3 points of contact between Buddhist and pragmatist philosophies that have not been discussed in literature yet. But I am not trying to equate Buddhism and pragmatism, because there are at least 2 significant differences. The first is that Dewey was a techno-optimist. He believed in technical progress, but he also had some important qualifications. For he required from technical progress that it intended to increase the meaningfulness of human experience, so that not anything will do. Only certain kinds of progress are acceptable. Only progress that makes us aware of what we are doing is acceptable. But in order to understand our world in any way, we need habits, and because habits are means to effects or means to ends, therefore we also need technical regulation to understand the world. So progress is a necessary but not sufficient condition of meaningful experience. But when we compare Dewey's doctrine with Buddhism, we don't find a counterpart at all, because to my knowledge, Buddhism does not commit to technical progress or regress, for that matter, at all. Another point of difference is ethics. Dewey's ethics can be described as enlightened hedonism, because he is a consequentialist. He believes that in order for anything to be valuable for human beings, it has to have valuable consequences. And this also includes pleasure, but doesn't reduce to it. So that there is no value that is not a value of some specific person. But we have to take the needs of other persons into account. And therefore, it's not hedonism as such, it's enlightened hedonism. So that the consequences are to be justly or evenly, or maybe fairly distributed, so that Dewey's ethics is not individualistic in the sense that everybody should be concerned of their own pleasure only, but they should take the pleasure of other people into account as well. But we don't find this in Buddhism. For as far as I understand correctly, Buddhist ethics aspires beyond pleasure and pain, so that in order to achieve a good life, we may have pleasures and pains, but they don't have the significance they have in Dewey's ethics. So that what is meaningful has nothing to do with our hedonic calculus or how we feel pleasure and pain. It's about our divesting ourselves of certain needs so that our habits don't condition what kind of persons we become. So this is a straight out contradiction between Dewey's ethics. So, to conclude, I have suggested that emptiness corresponds to anti-essentialism, conditionality corresponds to process ontology, and not self corresponds to a particular consequence of synechism. But I will be the first to confess that I am very ignorant of Buddhist philosophy, so all my results are tentative. I have been studying Buddhism only for roughly 3 years, maybe a bit more. And Buddhist philosophy has a history of 2,500 years, and it has given rise to many different schools of thought. So I have no chance of understanding the totality of the richness of Buddhist philosophy. So please take everything I have said with a grain of salt. And if I have been mistaken, please correct me. And here is my bibliography, if somebody is interested. Thank you for being present to my talk. And so we can conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Juho. Here's a Q&A session. And I'd like to inform beforehand, if you in the audience don't want to be recorded, I will put you at the end after the recording. So if you don't mind being recorded right now, please go ahead and raise hands or question directly. Do you want to turn off this slide?
Yes,
Juho?
Lauri Snellman. I was going to make two questions about Buddhism and anti-essentialism and process ontology. There's an interesting paper on different kinds of ontologies of relationships by Wesley Wildman, an introduction to relational ontology or something like that. I don't remember the title, but it discussed Persian semiotics, Buddhism, and also process ontologies and the essentialist matter form substance ontologies as all as kinds of relational ontologies. And there's some kind of comparison of these approaches in that paper. So maybe that's an interesting source.
Yes, that's indeed very interesting. Do you have my email address?
I guess that, yes, I do. And
yeah,
then
can you send the paper to me?
I can send a link. I remember that it was available through Professor Wildman's website. But then there's a second question that about, may I ask it?
Yep.
Yes, please. Yeah.
About essences and Peirce and pragmatism. I just kind of yesterday sent a paper on pragmatist, on the ontology, or more on the kind of game theory of habits, and I just kind of tried to bring it into a conversation with this kind of traditional Aristotelian essentialism. And and dispositionalism and this traditional matter form thinking, especially essences, I just kind of had this kind of idea that maybe you could even redefine essentialism from pragmatism, because Peirce talks a lot that objects are bundles of habits. So could you kind of argue that maybe there's a point of contact between essentialism and pragmatism after all? Because if you identify an object's essence with the kind of total habits or would-bes that it has, then it's kind of course, this is a question about how to relate all these different relational ontologies and so on.
If objects are bundles of habits, then I would say that yes, maybe essences can be redefined, but then these essences are completely empirical. So this refutes Aristotelianism, but at the same time, it preserves something about essentialism in some way. So we also could say that our habits could be different, so that there is a degree of contingency to these essences, so that for example, the concept of mass, it's very different in Newton and Einstein. And if we consider the practices how Newtonian mass is determined and the practices how Einsteinian mass is determined, we have completely different accounts. And therefore, we could say that the habits that pertain to the concept of mass have changed. So that in classical mechanics, we have one bundle of habits, and in relativistic mechanics, we have another bundle of habits. And therefore, the essence in Peircean sense has changed, and therefore it cannot be an Aristotelian essence. Does this answer your question?
Well, thanks for your answer. It just kind of, okay, thanks. It does.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, let's move on to another question. Jason?
Sorry, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good, excellent. So I just wanted to follow up on Shad's comment to Juho's very fascinating presentation. But first, to make it like a two-part thing. The first part, your reading of pragmatic maxim in terms of Buddhism, at least basics of Buddhism about not self. Do you believe that's a necessary consequence of understanding the pragmatic maxim? The pragmatic maxim necessarily implies that, or do you say this is a possible reading of the pragmatic maxim?
That's a good question, because I think it's only one possible interpretation, so that the pragmatic maxim itself has so many different interpretations that even Peirce himself put forward many. Like in his early account, the pragmatic maxim is a method, but in his later writings, he has invested it with truth value, so that it's a claim and not a method. And therefore, it can be proven. If it's a method, like the early Peirce said, it cannot be proven, it can be only adhered to. But if it's a thesis, then it does have a truth value and it can be proven. So even Peirce himself seems to have several interpretations of the pragmatic maxim. And I follow him in that, so that what I say is only one interpretation of the pragmatic maxim.
Yes, excellent. I agree with that. So I just would like to follow up here. I really appreciate your giving this Buddhist interpretation pragmatic maxim, because I hadn't thought of it before. But I want to stick up for Aristotle, um, speaking as a Peircean Aristotelian myself, but Aristotle as he was developed, as a thought was developed in the Byzantine period. So a reading of this is that an essence is not so much a bundle of habits as the unity of those habits, which could be expressed as a matrix of habits. So basically, we have a conditioned consequence: if A, then B. And when we talk about what a thing is, gold, uranium, a cat, whatever, then we have a whole set of if-then relationships, which can be laid down in terms of kind of a matrix. The case for an essence, I can find three reasons for saying that there would be an essence. First of all, the objective unity of what we're dealing with in practice in terms of multimodality. So for example, we're playing a sport such as volleyball. I see the volleyball flying through the air, and then I hit it. Seeing the volleyball is the visual modality. My hitting it involves a primarily kinesthetic modality, some other sensory modalities too. So for Aristotle, an essence is known only in terms of its powers and operations, but the ability to see that there's some kind of unity of those powers and operations across multiple modalities is what gives the essence some kind of job. And it's both empirical and trans-empirical. It's empirical in the sense of it has an empirical operation that we can see going on, although it's not empirical in the direct sense of, well, what color is the essence? It's more like this operational unity. The second is in terms of the dynamics of it. So for Aristotle, the paradigm is always the organism when talking about an essence. When an organism is at different stages of its life cycle, the same condition will have different consequences. So if you look at, say, a caterpillar and butterfly, put in the caterpillar stage, butterfly stage, same condition, you'll get different consequences. And then third is in terms of how Peirce situates the pragmatic maxim in 5 degrees of clarity. So the pragmatic maxim itself, as we know, is the third degree. We have the fourth degree, how that relates to the summum bonum of the cosmos, and fifth degree, concrete reasonableness. And I would say that an Aristotelian understanding of essence could fit those fourth and fifth degrees. I don't want to take away from your very excellent presentation, but I'm just saying that it's possible, as you say, different interpretations of pragmatic maxim, that we can give these possible interpretations. And I'd be very interested in putting sort of this Aristotelian Byzantine approach in dialogue with the Buddhist approach you've outlined.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting comment. Yes, I think that there can be a trans-empirical content to an essence, but at any rate, we don't have any reasons to believe in its existence save for experience, and therefore we can access trans-empirical essences only in terms of abductive inference. Would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah. And I believe Aristotle would too.
Yeah, okay. I think then we understand each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any more response or question or just comments?
I'll just clarify real quick and introduce myself. I'm Shad Gilbert. So I'm Shad. And this is Lowry Snellman. Yeah, good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Oh, not a question? Okay. Right. So if there's nothing more, I will go ahead myself. Thanks for your excellent talk. Likewise. I was wondering about a bunch of grains of thought or food for thought. And how shall I begin? Maybe just I will narrow down to one particular point. What is the common ground of logic between Buddhism and pragmatism? As you see, you are interested in abduction and Peircean and Deweyan methodologies or inquiries, right? So in their common inquiries, what kind of logic is exactly in common? Because if you study Buddhism, you will find that it's not an Aristotelian logic, right? It is a non-classical logic, so-called many-valued logic, four-valued, or if you go with Graham Priest, five-valued logic, or if you go with Jaina logic, seven-valued logic, and there are many types of logic in a non-classical way. And Peirce, of course, has a three-valued logic, including the limit, in addition to truth and falsity. So I was wondering, what kind of logic can be some comparative aspect?
Well, I have no position on logic at all, so
Oh,
anything that
you didn't have in mind any.
no, I'm not a logician. I know very little about logic.
But you mentioned abduction.
Yes.
So that's a type of inference to the best explanation, IBE, right?
Yes.
And that kind of inference can be also found in Buddhism or Buddhist inquiries. What do you think? Or what kind of text are you using? That's another question, but yeah, in Buddhism.
Well, I have no idea.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, Buddhism is also very broad. And I would appreciate it if you narrow down to some particular texts in which you can identify some similar or dissimilar logical arguments. And yeah, I think the pragmatic maxim is very important, but without understanding logic, as Peirce said, we can't understand pragmatism, right? So it's very important to study logic first. So also, in terms of abduction, furthermore, I may have some questions. Did you say that pragmatists start with induction, not abduction? In the middle of the talk, you said that you go with induction and then you will use abduction, or what is the process or steps in the pragmatist inquiry for Peirce?
I think I said that we begin with abduction.
Okay.
We first introduce a novel hypothesis.
Yeah.
Then we enter deduction. We derive some predictions on the basis of the hypothesis. And then induction, we experimentally test whether these consequences obtain. But if the experiment fails, then we have to revert to the abductive stage.
Right, yeah. Another hypothesis. Okay.
Yes.
So in that case, Buddhists in the Peircean way can start with abduction to create some new hypothesis, right? Because the point, one of the points I disagree with in your talk was the progress or regress in Buddhist approaches. Because Buddhists also go along with scientific progress or regress, on my understanding. Because the current Dalai Lama, a Tibetan Buddhist, said that if science develops, Buddhist doctrines also should change. Somewhere he said.
Yeah,
I forgot the scientist. Right. Yeah.
I think I have read it, but I'm confining myself to what remains of what Siddhartha Gautama himself said.
Okay.
And yeah,
not contemporary
so
Buddhism.
modern Buddhists may adhere to science, and I respect that, but I don't know about any commitments to science in the Nikaya texts that stem from the 3rd century BC.
So you are confining yourself within the Siddhartha's text.
Yes.
Only, okay. I see. Right. That's clear. That's very clear to me. And I'm looking forward to your paper out of this talk. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Sorry about my long question, but another person may have questions or comments.
I think I would just follow up with that a little bit. Maybe I hate to give advice, but maybe be a little careful when you say like Buddhists believe or Buddhists say, because it's a little bit like he just said that there are certain beliefs that are not shared among all Buddhists. And there were at least a few times where I thought, oh, well, Nagarjuna would certainly not agree with that concept, or his purpose was not exactly the way that it might have been expressed as you expressed it, in other words. So I think there were a few places with shunyata and some of the other concepts I thought, oh, I don't think that Nagarjuna would agree with the way that you're describing Buddhism. And of course, he would consider himself a Buddhist. So that might be the only like concern I had as I was listening.
Yeah.
And also maybe can I go a little farther with that also with even in pragmatism, I favor more William James, which he didn't come up at all in your talk, but definitely a pluralism that even to say that process ontology is pragmatist. I mean, my understanding of James would be it could be. I mean, it's one approach that we could use, but it's not like you can't say pragmatism equals.
Well, I didn't say that. I said that Peirce subscribed to process ontology.
Sure. Well,
I didn't say anything about James or Dewey.
Of course, I'm going to turn off my microphone, but I just wanted to say I'd be a little careful anytime that you describe pragmatism as a whole way of thinking and also Buddhism as a whole way of thinking, because there are so many exceptions to both of those. Thank you for your talk.
You were right. And I should have said that I'm confining myself to what Siddhartha Gautama himself said. And therefore, what I say doesn't apply to all variants of Buddhism. Yeah, I should have emphasized that.
Okay. Any other thoughts? If not, shall we conclude? Okay.
Yes.
Our APN webinar series continues monthly. So next month we will have another speaker's talk. So please look forward to that. And thanks again for your attention and presence. Goodbye.
Right. And to stay apprised of our webinar series, go to asianpragmatism.org. You can sign up to get the mailing list of the new webinars as they come out. And if you sign up, we'll send you a link about when we upload Juho's video to our YouTube channel. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Cheers.